Welcome back to another episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. I'm your host, Ann Margaret, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brent. To new and loyal listeners tuning in, this year marks the 25th year since the EAA officially first began operations back in 1996. And the EAA continues to make moves in 2021 with one of the agency's next generation signature projects, the EAA Field Research Park. In his debut feature on the Recharge Zone podcast, EAA Executive Director of Aquifer Management Services, Mark Hamilton, will provide the tale of how the agency's Aquifer Science Department is working to affirm that full-scale Berman soils can be winning water retention land management practices through Berman soil demonstration sites out at the Field Research Park, also known as the FRP.
Hey, welcome, Mark. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Brent, and thanks, Ann Margaret, for having me come on today. I'm excited to get to talk to everybody about this project that we're conducting at the FRP.
First off, Mark, can you share with us a little bit to our listeners about what the Field Research Park is all about?
Sure, Brent. So roughly a year or so ago, the Edwards Aquifer Authority and the Edwards Aquifer Conservancy was fortunate in receiving a 150-acre grant of land from the city of San Antonio, wherein we could conduct research basically in perpetuity. So we can conduct all types of groundwater-related research, or we can conduct practices that are designed to essentially work towards ensuring we maintain historical water quantity and quality. So by that I mean we can conduct different types of enhancement or restoration practices where we improve the soil profiles and do other things that will benefit both water quantity and quality over the long term. So being able to conduct research and make observations over long periods of time are really useful things to have in your toolbox when it comes to conducting meaningful research for groundwater systems and surface water systems and soil and land management practices.
All right, so this is a physical plot of land over the recharge zone. How large is this thing?
It's 151 acres.
Wow, and what watershed is it in?
It's within the Cibolo Creek Basin. So it's on the recharge zone, and in the Cibolo Creek, of course, that basin typically dry except in really wet years, but that Cibolo Creek Basin does offer a great deal of recharge in wet years, and therefore is a real important component to the system.
And Mark, you mentioned, as the Field Research Park, we're conducting research out there for water quality. Can you speak to some of the demonstration practices that are out there right now and what we plan to do in the future out there?
All right, let me see if I can kind of give a high-level overview of the different things that we're doing. So when we talk about land management, that's really aimed at restoring the land, the surface of the land, to what it could be, to help the land overcome. So in many places, for example, a lot of our region has lost a great deal of soil. And soil plays a fairly important role with regard to allowing infiltration into the aquifer, as well as filtering runoff so that your runoff is clean. So when that runoff gets into Cibolo Creek, for example, we want to ensure that that runoff is clean and free of debris or free of soil particles that could potentially be a negative or an undesirable component to recharge. So one of the things that we started with out at the Field Research Park towards the middle of last year is we installed what we call Berman swale system. So that's literally describes what it is. It's a shallow swale, an area where you take an excavator and dig it out, but you only dig it out about 10 or 12 inches deep, and then you build a berm on the downslope or downgradient side of that. And you just use the spoil material from your swale to build a berm. And the whole structure is surveyed in such that it will drain, but it drains fairly slowly. So you're trying to hold back as much water as you can. So once you construct this berm and swale, Then you would cover the berm portion with a combination of compost and mulch and overseed it. So you have a root zone there keeping everything in place. And then you come back and install woody vegetation across the top of the berm. And there's a number of reasons for all that, but essentially what it does is it captures a portion of surface runoff from the areas up gradient of it and holds it in place just a little bit longer. It still drains off, but it holds it in base a little longer. It helps that runoff to drop any sediment load that it has. So you're enhancing your soil profile where you do this.
If I may help our listeners visualize, up on the recharge zone where the water actually enters the aquifer, the typical terrain is very, very steep and rocky. And our storms typically are very flashy, so we have lots of rain, high intensity rainfall, and a lot of that just runs right off and off the recharge zone before it can go in. And so what Mark is talking about here is trying to slow that flow during these rain events and give it more time to soak in. And this soaking in process, this recharge in between stream basins, we call diffuse recharge. So it's being recharged intermittently before it hits the stream. And so this whole process is built to capture that and slow it down. Is that right, Mark?
That's it. And one of the problems we have in a lot of places is that runoff is so flashy that it wants to, if you don't have an adequate amount of vegetation in place to hold the soil, then it will pick up soil and debris and wash that into the creeks. And we would prefer that didn't happen. So this is it's a practice that is really designed to accomplish a number of things, like you just spoke to there. You want to slow some component of the surface runoff, but you don't want to hold it. It's not like building a tank or a dam. It's completely different in that it still allows that water to run off. It just slows it down so that any natural infiltration that will take place, but you're wetting your landscape. You're not preventing that from happening.
I have a question. So I knew you all mentioned the contributing zone and the recharge zone. So these berm and swales, so I know you said it's, and I've seen it out there at the FRP, it's like a soil mound and you plant plants on there. So can this be replicated for people, just everyday households that are in those zones? What I'm trying to say is like the demonstration site out there, is that the ultimate purpose?
Really, one of our primary goals is to conduct a number of different practices at a demonstration scale. So that's really how we're terming a lot of this work. We want to be able to demonstrate a number of different practices. So the berm and swale is one, simple rock berms, brush berms, all of those things will be demonstrated. But in addition, we've gone to lengths to make sure that we overseed with different types of cover crop, because you really want to have that vegetation in place. And then also installing woody vegetation, various types of native trees, which also provide a benefit. So there's just there's a number of benefits that have potential to come from this. It's not limited to trying to maintain water quality and that historical recharge that we talk about a lot, but it's also an opportunity, if done correctly, over time to sequester some amount of carbon, right, through the growth of the woody species that we install. And those woody species also, you can think of it this way, I guess, they have a relationship with the soil and they actually have potential to create additional pathways into the upper portions of the rock body beneath the soil. So the epikarst, that process, that natural process that occurs, you see it repeated throughout the hill country, with a lot of trees. Well, there's some evidence that that's actually beneficial overall to the ability of the landscape to infiltrate water and allow it to become recharged, which in turn, that has opportunity not just to benefit the Edwards Aquifer, but to also benefit things like bank storage, where you can maintain stream flows longer after a big rainfall event, because It allows that water to soak into the soil and then seep out slowly into the adjacent stream beds. It also could have the added benefit of bolstering spring flows. So we're trying to look at this in a very holistic fashion by conducting a number of practices and demonstrating those practices, but also conducting the appropriate science to measure the benefits of those practices. Because without that component in place, it's very difficult to speak to the specifics of the benefits, right? You can look at these things and say, oh, wow, this looks like a good thing to do. And there's a number of things you can point to that are obvious benefits, but I don't feel like we should be subjective. We need to be objective. And to do that, we need to appropriately measure and to the degree that we can quantify what benefits arise from these different types of practices. And then it makes it a lot easier to speak to specifics and more specifically to answer your question. At the residential scale, this may not be very effective because a city lot doesn't have a lot of room to do that. And I'm not implying that you shouldn't plant trees at your house or maintain a good landscape where you're allowing that soil that's at your landscape to stay in place, but you do need some amount of property to effectively conduct a lot of these practices.
Yeah, Mark, so I guess that's one defining feature about this whole project is we're not looking for just anecdotal evidence of it working. We're trying to, measure it working and quantify that and demonstrate that through science. So we're not just, it's not just our opinion out there.
Exactly. Right. And that science is also fairly comprehensive. It's not just measuring the water balance, measuring how much surface runoff we have and measuring the different conduits that we have conducting water across the site, trying to measure how much water moves through those. We're measuring the rainfall. We're measuring soil moisture. We're working towards developing some methodology to measure how much moisture flux there is through the soil into the epikarst. Are in the process currently of installing a eddy covariance tower to measure evapotranspiration. And we've also developed some relationships with universities to come in and do some very detailed work regarding soil health so that we can look at soil biology, both at the bacterial level and the fungal level, to understand the changes that occur over time. So as we build the organic content in that soil, what changes with the soil biology and ecology, and how much does it change the soil's ability to both infiltrate and to hold a larger amount of water in place for a longer time, therefore benefiting vegetation. It's a very holistic approach. So we're trying to kind of marry a lot of different sciences together, as well as what some people might term some permaculture type practices, where we install berms and swales and rock berms and brush berms and enhance the vegetation, install new or additional woody species in select locations, all of those things together, trying to marry those different fields of endeavor into a benefit for the aquifer overall and a benefit for the region.
Speaking of that, Mark, we had EAA General Manager Roland Ruiz on last month talking about the next generation concept, which is essentially a legacy water quality initiative with conservation programs and other initiatives. So can you tell us, how does the Field Research Park fit into next generation, and what's that going to look like moving forward?
Well, my hope is that the Field Research Park becomes a catalyst for certain components of the next generation by functionally demonstrating these different practices and then over time measuring and discussing and documenting those benefits. I think that plays very well into the next generation, because part of that program, that next generation Edwards Aquifer Protection Program, will speak to incentivizing these practices across the region. But the dollars will always be limited, and we need to do what we can now to ensure that the practices we conduct are the most effective for the area they're being conducted in. So there may be, for example, there could be properties where it's perhaps just as effective to do some rock berms at a perhaps lower cost and still reap some measurable benefit versus other properties. It may be most effective to install berms and swales, add a lot of woody vegetation, do some cover cropping, and we just need to learn more about these different practices and then truly measure those benefits so that we can speak to the benefits with a good data set standing behind that conversation.
All right, Mark, in your kind of introduction, you talked about how the property was donated by the city as part of the EAPP program, the Edwards Aquifer Protection Program. And I recall as part of that, the adjacent property was going to be converted into Morgan's Wonderland Camp. And at that camp, we're going to have a facility there called the Education and Outreach Center, which is a facility meant to teach children and other community members all about the aquifer. Is there any relationship between that EOC, the Education and Outreach Center, and the FRP and the EAA? So what's the connection there? How do you tie all that together?
Well, I think there's tremendous opportunity. So in some ways, I view the Education Outreach Center as really, to some degree, becoming the face of awareness raising or education about the aquifer. So as we raise awareness and we speak to the things that are going on at the FRP, I think there will be opportunity for some organized field trips by interested parties through the EOC to come and actually see what we're doing. Another component to that, in addition to having some type of organized approach to allowing members of the public to look into these practices, to actually come down and see, here's what's going on, here's what this is about, here's how we think it works, and here's what we're doing on the scientific side to better measure and understand those things. We also intend to take real-time data that's being collected at the Field Research Park and display that data at the Education Outreach Center so that people are able to observe in real time, well, how much soil moisture is there at this location? What's the temperature? How much rainfall have we had in the last 2 months or the last 10 years or the last 2 days? What are the groundwater levels? All of our wells that we have out there have continuous monitoring systems on them, and we can display that data at the EOC so that people can kind of start to get a glimpse into what the scientific community is doing in terms of data collection. And then on occasion, when we have opportunity to conduct some field trips, we can better explain, well, remember the data that you were able to observe at the EOC, this is how that data is being used to analyze the impacts or the efficacy of these different practices at the FRP, with the hope that we can develop a more sustainable aquifer system to face all the uncertainties that are coming over the next 100 years. So it's a very holistic approach. It's a big picture set of ideas, and I see the FRP as being a component and a resource to both the EOC and to the next generation EAPP, as well as an opportunity for our science and research group, the Aquifer Management Services Group, to really have opportunity to make these long-term observations over a number of different hydrological cycles, where we can get a much better understanding of how the system works under different stresses. So in the end, we're able to, as an agency, offer better management strategies of the system and be more effective at what we do while creating a more sustainable future for the aquifer.
Mark, thank you so much for sharing this valuable information about the Field Research Park as it pertains to Edwards Aquifer research, the next generation concept, and the strategic plan of the Edwards Aquifer Authority. I really appreciate your time today.
I greatly appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that is more than just work. It's a passion.
And I really appreciate too, Mark, the real world applicability of everything, and how when the research is conducted and you kind of have that data to speak to, I'm excited to see where the demonstrations that you all have planned for the future go, and kind of how we build upon that. And like you mentioned, the Education Outreach Center, the opportunities for people to understand kind of the aquifer science world of things in the Education Outreach Center and vice versa?
I'm excited about it as well. So I look forward to the future. I think it may reasonably could take us some number of years to get very useful and meaningful scientific results, but it's certainly a worthwhile endeavor. And if we didn't feel like there were true benefits that would come from this, we wouldn't dedicate the resources to it. But there's just great opportunity here for, I think, for the region, for the aquifer, as well as all of our staff and others to be a part of this over time.
Thanks, y'all, for tuning in to this episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. Have questions, ideas for topics, or things you would like to share with us? Well, reach out to us at rechargezone@edwardsaquifer.org.